Okay, so now you are either watching one of two things. Either you are watching the condensed version of this discussion in the actual review video of the FP, or you are watching the full discussion that we are about to have, which we uploaded as a separate video to YouTube, and who knows how long that is. It may end up being an hour even. But quickly, just to recap the review, for those watching the full version, Leaf started out the video, and you want to recap what you talked about, Leaf?
Sure. So in the beginning of the video, I was looking at the build quality, the connectivity, and the basic specifications for video shooting. And I have no complaints with build quality. It is of excellent quality. I just couldn't find any fault in that. Other than, not build quality really, but with the ports, I would have preferred a removable cover for the headphone jack and the USB-C rather than those little rubbery things, because those are just irritating. But
also with the way they're marketing this camera, a headphone port would have made sense, but with the actual thing we think this camera should be used for, it doesn't make sense, so we'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah, it gets better. Anyhow, no headphone port, as Noah said, irritating for what they're marketing towards. But other than that, the connectivity is really good. The build quality is great. And then the specifications are really good too. Like for the video, on paper, it's an amazing camera. And then also, I would have to, well, we'll get more into exactly what it's like to use.
In reality, it is an amazing camera, and you get awesome video. But
high quality, high fidelity video that can be edited well, but we'll be covering that more.
We're jumping a little bit ahead of the curve. Basically, after that, I described what this camera was like to shoot in a studio, and the conclusion from that was basically, since it doesn't have a headphone port, and it doesn't have a tilty or flippy outy screen, then you either need another person and some type of audio redundancy, or you need an external recorder / monitor, with a headphone output of some sort.
Yes.
I also talked about the process of filming a video outside with this camera. We filmed a video and posted that on YouTube. It's Tripod Hacks, and it turned out really well, I think, but it was also a little bit difficult to use at the time, and it ended up being a little frustrating because the screen is not the greatest. It's not super bright. It's not super high fidelity.
Yeah.
And so even with focus peaking, since the autofocus on this thing is basically unusable, I mean, single point might have worked, but it was just as fast, and honestly, I trusted myself more to pull focus manually with this camera. But because the focus peaking isn't the most accurate, and because the screen is not great, we looked back at the clips, and half of them were ever so slightly out of focus, meaning it was slightly soft, and we determined it ended up being usable with some digital sharpening, but it was very frustrating.
Well, see, I don't know if it was necessarily the focus peaking being off. It's focus peaking needs a bright screen. You need a bright screen to use focus peaking effectively.
Well, here's the thing. I was able to see the focus peaking, and it was on your face. So the problem is that the focus peaking isn't that accurate, because it was also, even at lower apertures like f6, it was focus peaking on some of the tree branches in the background that were definitely out of focus, but because they were thin lines and harder lines, the camera thought they were in focus.
Yeah, so that can also really get you. So when using focus peaking with this camera, be wary, because of that and the dim screen, it can be very hard to get focus.
Unless you're using an external monitor with its own focus peaking, that will work better.
Yes. Or like an external recorder, like the Atomos Ninja 5 or whatever other recorder you might have. So then
then after
Yeah.
that, it was technical tests that I performed. And let me just say off the bat, you don't need to perform technical tests on this camera and its sensor to determine that it has an amazing image. The image quality is really good. In MOV, it's definitely great, and in DNG, it's simply amazing.
Yeah.
But the test that I performed, let's see, the first one was the different color modes for MOV. Basically, there are a few that are usable, but really none of them are ideal for color grading. Standard would probably be what I went with, and then I would just leave it as is. I wouldn't even bother color grading it. I could go with neutral, but that has a slight bit of over sharpening. I could go with off, which is kind of like a pseudo log, but that's crazy over sharpened, and I actually had to blur some of the footage that we got in that color mode because it just looked awful with the digital sharpening. And then Cine is just completely useless. I thought it would be great, but there's no dynamic range. There's no gradability whatsoever, and the colors are very inaccurate, and I don't personally like the look of it. Anyway, then I tested the low light performance. I would draw the line probably. It's nothing to brag about. I would probably draw the line around 6400 ISO with noise reduction in post-production. It's really not great for a full-frame camera. I would have expected a little bit better. I would be comfortable shooting 6400 on my Sony A7riii without noise reduction.
However, RAW is always quite a bit noisier, and if you are using like DaVinci Studio or Premiere Pro for noise reduction, like if I threw it in Premiere, I could probably get another stop of very clean looking video, because noise reduction on RAW video is always done, and DNG files are noisy, but they can be denoised quite a bit.
And then I also tested the Super 35 crop. Whether you're shooting in 1080 or 4K, it's basically the same sharpness, same noise level. And I also did less technical tests with dynamic range, and it is really good on this camera. If you know how to work with the with the DNG raw files, you can recover highlights you never thought were possible to recover, and the shadows are decently recoverable. Again, you have to know how to work with the footage. And we might have a full tutorial on that. If not, you can go to the review and see the clip where we bring the files into the editor and show you how easy they are to do a quick grade on. So then, Leaf, you were the presenter for another segment.
Yes, the last segment where I was talking about how it is to shoot with this camera in the real world. For me, my experience with it. And this is where we kind of ran into the contradiction that this camera is. So it's primarily marketed towards a lower end, like a lower end market, the average consumer, which to me doesn't make sense for a few reasons, and then makes sense for a couple of reasons. So I'm going to go over why they'd market it towards your average consumer. One, its price. It's $1,700. That's cheap. Two, it can live stream. That's a great feature in a camera. Three, it shoots RAW for cheap. So right there, you're like, wow, I get this camera that shoots RAW for cheap, and I can live stream with it. And that's great for lower budget, YouTubers. But then comes the problem where there's no compressed RAW. And uncompressed RAW, which is what this camera shoots, are absolutely enormous files. A terabyte can be filled up with just like 40 to 50 minutes of recording at its highest record setting.
Yeah, it gets about 50 minutes on a terabyte at DNG 12-bit.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely insane.
So with no compressed RAW, you're running into these massive file sizes that are just... Yes, you can edit it on a fairly average computer, but the amount of storage you need and the amount of money it costs to store this is through the roof. Also, if you're gonna be realistically, this camera doesn't cost $1,700. You need a lens. So if you get the kit lens, that's $1,900. Then you need to buy a couple terabytes of SSDs, which is gonna be like $400 more. So like I would actually say, also you're gonna need a monitor or an external recorder. So it ends up turning out to be like a $3,000 camera once you consider the expense of recording all that data. And then you're like, is this really the best option for a lower end consumer? Because the idea of RAW is nice, but when it's uncompressed, doesn't make sense to me.
Right. At that price, you have competitors out there like the S1H. That's around $3,500, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's $3,700 without a lens, so maybe not quite that high. A7S3 is about $3,500 without a lens, but still, that's only $700 more with a lens, and you don't need an external monitor necessarily. You don't need a bunch of external SSDs, which are pricey. But even below that, suddenly it's competing with higher-end cameras. Not the $1,500 cameras, but the $3,000 cameras. Double its price, basically.
So, I will have to say, here, if this camera excels in one particular area, in my opinion, and that is being a secondary camera in a larger budget shoot, or being a primary camera, it definitely could be, in a higher budget production, where you are actually using that 12-bit DNG RAW, and you have proper stabilization equipment, you have fluid head tripods, you have nice gimbals, you have cranes, you have all this other equipment necessary, plus external recorders to fully get the true capabilities out of this camera, where you can get an image that's equivalent to some $6,000, $7,000, even $8,000 cinema cameras off of this tiny body. It's just you need to rig it out, so it ends up costing like $3,000 to $4,000, which is fine, considering you're still chopping the price in half from these higher end cinema cameras to get a similar image. But I don't see this as a consumer level camera.
Yeah, and when we say higher budget, we don't necessarily mean a high budget professional movie where they're going to be spending millions, of course.
No, I'm talking where you might have a few grand.
Yeah, say you have $5,000 spent on equipment for a shoot, or just for your style of shooting. Then this camera makes a lot of sense. It's basically the closest thing I can attribute it to is the Sony FX3, which is even advertised as their cinema line of cameras. It's a bit more expensive, but it doesn't shoot RAW internally. So you're probably going to be getting a similar image off that, and that does have in-body stabilization. So,
but you're not getting the RAW.
But you're not getting RAW, but you are getting excellent autofocus. So if you have $5,000 to spend on a camera, you could get the FX3 with a nice tripod, a similar lens, or you could get the FP with SSDs, a good tripod, gimbal, similar lenses, a monitor or an external recorder, and you could have RAW. I would personally, for what I shoot, I would personally choose the FX3 still, because I don't need to be working in RAW, because I just don't need to be. I don't need to keep all those terabytes of files.
So, I would
also
put those
autofocus.
Yeah, I would put those two cameras in completely different classes, mainly because of, like, the FP is not for what I see it being best at, it doesn't need autofocus. You have a focus puller. You either have a very skilled operator, or you have a director who's a focus puller, or a separate focus puller.
With a wireless module.
Yeah, with a wireless module. And if you had
Cineglass.
that, yes, definitely Cineglass. But if you had that, you could get some. You would be getting like Hollywood grade, like Hollywood quality video out of this. Whereas with the Sony, what was that, the
FX3 slash A7R, it's a A7S3.
Yeah, it's not the same.
I don't know.
I would
The
consider
FX3
that to be more of the consumer level.
I disagree. The FX3 meets the Netflix requirements as a certified camera. Their whole
Oh yeah, it
certified
definitely
camera
would.
thing.
But I'm saying I wouldn't, like, if you're going for a true cinema camera. So autofocus does not matter really in cinema cameras.
No, but the problem is they're advertising this camera, the FP, towards consumers.
Yeah, which is where you need the good autofocus, where you need Canon autofocus or Sony autofocus or Fujifilm autofocus. Focus that can be reliable, that just works. That can track faces, that can track objects. Because if you can't do that, then how am I going to film this video that I'm filming right now if I don't have a monitor, Actually, I would probably want a wireless focus pulling module for it. And at that point, I'm like, I would just spend a little extra money because I don't need RAW. I'd spend some more money on a nicer, like, generally considered consumer mirrorless camera. So marketing towards this camera towards the average consumer, it doesn't make sense to me.
No.
But it's an amazing camera.
Right. And let me get a little bit deeper into this. Leaf and I, when we first heard that Sigma was going to send us this gear, this camera with these lenses, we immediately start brainstorming all these things we could do with it. And one of those things we thought of was a short film of Leaf's puppy Leo, which he's gonna end up shooting this weekend, but he's gonna do it on his Fuji unless he's changed his mind.
Probably gonna do it on my Fuji.
And we ended up we planned out the whole review, and we were gonna display this short film in the review. Then we get to his house to film the clip of him outside shooting with it, talking about how it works when shooting his puppy. And before we shot that clip, we ended up having a 20-minute discussion, rediscussing what we were going to be saying in that clip, because we don't even have a monitor. We're a very low-budget production. So with just that LCD, trying to pull focus on a spastic, practically untrained puppy, it would just be really, really difficult, and to work with, and it's going to take a lot of footage to get that. So suddenly, you're talking about a lot of D&G footage, but if you shoot an MOV, you're going to get log and just overall better quality very
Definitely
similar
better
quality at least, on Leaf's Fuji. Now, we've been kind of harping on this camera quite a bit. In the review, we were nitpicking on these little things. We've been complaining about the LCD, and we're talking about how it just doesn't make sense for the market. But at the end of the day, is it a good camera? Yeah. Is it an amazing image? Yeah. And did it inspire us to create awesome content? Very much so. It was extremely exciting to have a new camera in hand, and maybe that was just because we don't use that much new gear all the time. But we both went out and we just shot whatever we saw, whatever we thought could make good shots, even if it was just boring focus pulls of moss. And we enjoyed doing it. So if you want to work with D&G,
this is the camera for you.
You think that this camera's form factor makes sense, you don't mind a couple $100 for a lens with decent focus ring for focus pulling, and SSDs, did I mention that? Then this camera definitely does make sense for you. Compared to the competition, I don't know. It's a personal choice, of course.
I think.
And again, we love this camera. We just think it's a little confusing to us because we're not exactly sure what it's trying to do. Is it trying to be a B camera for professionals who want a small camera to hook onto a car or to a chest mount? Or is it aimed at consumers as a stepping stone for RAW, which could also be good, except that the LCD isn't great and there's not great autofocus, which someone getting into the cinema side of recording video would probably still be relying on, and I think should be still relying on as they learn the RAW workflow, which, it isn't that steep a learning curve, but it's different.
Yeah, and so definitely an amazing camera, high fidelity images, and great specifications. Just make sure that it's right for you, because it's a confusing camera.
If you're uncertain, I would say rent this camera and try it out for a week. You're gonna need SSD if you want to record RAW, and ideally you'd have a monitor as well. But rent it. It'll maybe be $100 for a week. I don't know. I'm not that familiar with renting prices. Maybe a couple $100. But then finally, let's talk about what we think Sigma could do with an FP2 or the next iteration of an FP, because they released the FPL. That's not. I don't think that's a replacement for this camera. That camera is even more confusing than this FP, and I would not buy that camera. I'm sorry, Sigma. We love you. We love your company. Seriously, we do. But that camera doesn't make sense to us, and that's a whole other video, or a whole other email discussion.
So I think what I would want to see in a FP2. So, if you are really marketing this, depending on who you're marketing this towards, depending on who you want.
And just to be clear here, we're talking directly to you,
so
Sigma.
So if this is for the consumer, the average consumer, it needs decent autofocus, because I can't pull focus vlogging.
And
I can't. And it needs...
And you took a massive step in the right direction with the FPL, adding phase detection autofocus points. Obviously, we haven't tested that camera. I would love to see how the autofocus performs, especially compared to the FP. But it needs to be near Sony, Fuji level. Throw Canon in there too. I think it should be able to track faces decently, or at least reliably continually autofocus on one single point.
That is important. Now, I also think if you're gonna push this towards consumers, average consumers, give us more options in the MOV file and give us compressed RAW. Those two right there would put this camera miles ahead of where it is right now. If I could choose my picture profile, choose my bit rates, if I could choose whether I shoot H.264 or H.265, or if it's 10-bit or 8-bit in MOV, I would have all of a sudden have crazy capabilities here. Give a log option too. This is all software stuff.
And maybe we're wrong, but that sounds like the kind of thing that could be updated with firmware, and maybe that's even a paid upgrade. I would pay $200 for that.
Heck,
if I were
I would
buying
pay
this camera.
$300
in a heartbeat.
So
because suddenly with those options, you're not stuck with the massive file sizes of DNG, and you're not stuck with the only somewhat gradable. It's not bad, but it's not amazing. MOV
but
file.
You still have the capabilities to have that amazing quality uncompressed DNG RAW, which is incredible. So,
I think the last thing I would want to see is a modification to the body, whether that is
an add-on modifier like a battery grip.
First off, yes, I think a battery grip that extends the grip of the camera so that it's easier to hold, it's easier to do run and gun with. I think that would be really awesome. Maybe you could even hook that into the little pin ports on the side of the FP and suddenly give the option for a CFast card. Because, then you could probably shoot compressed RAW onto that, because those are way faster than SD cards. I'm not sure the price per gigabyte compared to SSDs.
It's a little higher than SSDs, but it would give you that capability to be like, I need some raw video in this situation. I'm going to start recording onto my CFast.
Right.
You know,
and not worry about finding an SSD, plugging it in, having it dangling off the camera, or finding some way to secure it to your tripod or whatever.
Yeah.
A tilty screen, even just up and down, it doesn't necessarily have to flip out all the way to see yourself when you're recording by yourself. That would be a plus, especially for consumers who are one-man bands trying to film themselves like I often do.
Yep.
But you can work without it. And then, did I say headphone port?
You did not, but headphone port.
Yeah, even if that were in that side grip, which I don't think it should be priced as high as your viewfinder was priced. But again, a couple $100 I would pay for that.
Okay,
So
if it was giving
those are our thoughts.
If it was giving me CFast card capabilities, I would pay more than a couple $100 for it, because that's a whole nother add-on. Like,
True.
but like, even if it was just batteries, I would still pay a couple $100 for it, because it would make the camera a lot more easy to just run and gun with.
Yeah, the battery on this thing isn't bad. We were able to last all day on like 1.5 charges, but you know, you can never do with too much. You can never have too much battery power. And maybe with these critiques, you're thinking, no, that wouldn't work for so and so reason. Maybe we're just young and naive, but that's our opinion. Yeah,
and you know, I think if some of those could be corrected, some of those little if some of those changes could be implemented into an FP2, even just a third of them, it would make the camera, you know, leaps and bounds better than where it is, and better than the competition. So
yes, this is really, really close. To beating the competition by a long shot. I think there are just a few things that cause it to fall behind. And by the way, if you want to hire us as developers on this camera,
yes,
we would be shocked. And probably not very good at the job.
Yeah, probably terrible at it. Okay, yeah, so that's our
hot take.
Our hot take on the FP. L. No, not FP.
No,
on the FP.
just the FP.
The FP.
The FPL is a whole other story, as we were saying.
Oh my gosh, I really want to get my hands on that and test it, because it's weird.
It would be really cool. But again, it just seems like an even more confusing camera than this. And hopefully we did a good job explaining ourselves and explaining what we think of this camera, because it is really quite weird. The title of Caleb Pike's review back when this was released was, I think, perfect. It's a really weird, confusing camera, but we love it.
Okay, there we are.
Talk?
I'm back.
There we go.
Yeah. Are you?
Yes, you are.
I was connected to a speaker somewhere in the house, and I don't know. So your voice was blasting at full volume somewhere in this household.
Yeah, you connected to my speaker.
All right, so that's about all we have on this camera, I think.
We will try to compress this discussion into something coherent in the full review.
Hopefully. Hopefully.
It'll be rough.
Yeah. But okay, yeah, I think it was really good discussing. I think we got our point across about this camera. Yep. And I hope this helped people. And if you've watched through this whole 45 to an hour long video, good for you. You deserve a gold star. I want you to go home and eat a cookie, because you deserve that. Have anything else, or are we good to sign off here?
I think we're good.
All right, you want a subscriber plug, or?
Nah, let's just leave it at go watch the full review.
Yep, go watch the full review.